let me introduce Mr. Karma. This is the second time. Mr. Karma is going to talk to us today about his outlook of restructuring Venezuelan sovereign debt post-Maduro. Steve is the founder and president of Karma and Associates, a New York City-based strategic advisory firm specializing in providing strategic advice to clients involved in complex and challenging international restructuring situations, with a special focus on emerging markets around the globe. Mr. Karma is a leading expert on international debt structuring and cross-border insolvency, and he served formerly as the General Counsel of the New York State Financial Control Board. This is the chief financial oversight agency for New York City, and as the lead attorney with Export-Import Bank of the United States, the official export credit agency of the U.S. government. He has worked on numerous high-profile and complex restructuring and infrastructure project transactions in emerging markets. He has also advised multilateral institutions and national government in developing countries and emerging markets on a wide range of financial and commercial matters. He has published numerous articles in leading professional journals, held leadership positions in major professional organizations, and taught at law school in the U.S. and China, including Peking University School of International Law, Swensen, and University of International Business and Economy in Beijing. He is frequently invited to lecture at prestigious forums around the world, including programs in Africa, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and North America. He is a fellow of the American College of Bankruptcy, a founding member of former two-term board member of the International Insolvency Institute, and a member of the International Exchange of Experience on Insolvency Law. He served as a co-chair of the American Bar Association Subcommittee on International Bankruptcy of the Business Bankruptcy Committee, and currently serves as the vice chair of his coordinating committee for the United States Commission on International Trade Law, and as an ABA delegate to UNCITRAL, Working Group 5, Insolvency Law. He's a former Henry Luce Scholar in Singapore, and he received his Juris Doctor from Yale Law School, and his BA from Swansea College. Okay, Mr. Cannon, so let me open you.
Thank you very much, Carlos, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thanks to you and Eduardo for inviting me back to speak to your organizations. It's a great pleasure to do so. I remember how much I enjoyed doing it in the summer of 2023. Of course, at that time, we had no inkling that Mr. Maduro would be removed from Venezuela by a U.S. military operation. So today we're talking about a different set of facts. And so what I would like to do this morning is discuss the outlook for Venezuelan sovereign debt restructuring post-Maduro. Okay. So we start in the immediate aftermath of the January 3rd capture of Maduro. And right away, the markets responded quite exuberantly to the news of Maduro's capture. The price for Venezuelan bonds surged on that news. They increased from, say, 20 or 30 cents on the dollar. They increased from 30 cents, 20 to 30 cents on the dollar. So it was quite a surge in the prices of the bonds. The prices, I can find those for you, but basically the prices increased significantly right after Maduro was captured. The expectation among bond investors was that with Maduro no longer on the scene, that debt restructuring negotiations might be forthcoming in the near future. And so there was great optimism, and whether that exuberance was justified is another question, but the markets are the markets, and the holders of the bonds reacted quite positively almost immediately on the first day of trading after the capture on January 23rd. The bonds have continued to trade up from where they were on January 3rd. I was mentioning the bonds were at the low 30s right after, and this week apparently they're trading, the Venezuelan bonds trading around 42 cents on the dollar. Just over a year ago, they were at about 16 cents on the dollar. So you can see the jump in prices on the Venezuelan bonds in light of this recent development. Now, other stakeholders also responded very positively. One of the bondholder committees said it was ready to negotiate with the new government in Venezuela. Of course, they would need the approvals, and they recognize that, from OFAC, OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and within the U.S. Treasury Department. As you all know, the OFAC sanctions previously blocked U.S. creditors from negotiating with the Venezuelan government. So for negotiations to commence with the Rodriguez-led government, they would need to get relief, a so-called license from OFAC. There's such optimism that some creditors and particular bondholders, they believe a restructuring could be completed fairly quickly once it's started, whether that's 1 year or 2 years, which is a pretty short period of time for a major sovereign debt restructuring such as we're confronting with Venezuela. Next slide, please. Yet, despite this market optimism, Venezuela's fundamentals remain essentially unchanged. I spoke about this when we last convened in August 2023, but Venezuela faces a series of overlapping crises, and those haven't changed since I last spoke to you. The economy has collapsed since the onset of the crisis in the mid-2010s. As many of you know, the economy has contracted by nearly 75% since the crisis began. And that's a huge contraction. Larger contraction than even the United States suffered in the Great Depression, or that Greece suffered in the Eurozone crisis of the 2010s. Simultaneously, Venezuela faces a humanitarian crisis, a dire humanitarian crisis. The social indicators are very grim. The poverty rate is very high. Access to medical care is limited, and the availability of medicines. And then there's widespread food insecurity and malnutrition. And as a result, there's been a huge outflow of Venezuelan citizens to other countries. The reports are that there are 8 million or more Venezuelans who have fled Venezuela since the crisis began. Some of the figures are higher than the 8 million. But that's a huge loss of human capital, whether that's 20 or 25% of the Venezuelan population before the crisis began. Then what we'll be talking about today is the third crisis or serious challenge. Venezuela's got a massive debt burden of an estimated $150 billion or greater. Even for sovereign debt restructurings, as we'll see in a moment, that's a huge number. And a fourth related crisis is that notwithstanding the removal of Maduro from Venezuela on January 3rd, Venezuela still faces a crisis of political legitimacy. Yes, Maduro was removed from power, but many key players from the Maduro-era regime continue to wield significant influence, notwithstanding Delcy Rodriguez's cabinet reshuffle. I saw in the last day or two a new Minister of Defense has been appointed, but from what I read in the Financial Times and elsewhere, he does not come to that position with a particularly great reputation, to put it mildly. The U.S. government has formally recognized the government led by Delcy Rodriguez. However, there's not yet been broad international recognition of the new regime. And the democratic opposition in Venezuela, led by Ms. Machado, has been effectively sidelined under current arrangements. The Rodriguez government has basically sidelined them. And it should be noted, the U.S. government has not really provided any encouragement, support for the opposition, as was made clear when President Trump spoke at his news conference on January 23rd. So we still have this political standoff between the opposition and the Chavista political regime. Next slide, please. Now, when people look at the Venezuelan situation, they tend to focus on their own particular set of interests or issues. Some think about the debt restructuring, others think about economic issues, some think about humanitarian issues. But what I want to argue is that one cannot take a siloed approach to the Venezuelan situation. Any eventual debt restructuring, for example, in Venezuela cannot be divorced from other structural changes facing Venezuela. Debt restructuring will depend on the economic situation being straightened out, the humanitarian situation being straightened out. For example, on the economic front, without a well-functioning and productive economy, Venezuela will not be able to generate the resources necessary to support any debt restructuring deal on a sustainable basis. In other words, the parties could reach a debt restructuring deal, but if the economy is still in a shambles, that restructuring deal will not be sustainable over the longer term. On the humanitarian side, in order to have a productive economy, Venezuela requires a population that is not suffering from all the afflictions I mentioned earlier, such as malnutrition and food insecurity, lack of proper health care, lack of access to medicines, and the extreme poverty that's so prevalent in Venezuela. In addition, the recovery of the Venezuelan economy will also be hindered by the loss of human capital represented by that massive emigration of 8 million or more Venezuelan citizens. There's a large pool of talent represented in those who have left Venezuela, and that talent, that experience will be critical for Venezuela to get its economy back on its feet. Next slide, please. And on the political front, any restructuring deal will require the acceptance of the deal by the Venezuelan public, especially if they are being asked to make sacrifices as part of the restructuring, which is not uncommon in these sovereign debt restructurings. Yet, such acceptance will be hard to obtain without a legitimate and credible Venezuelan government being in place. Venezuela's recovery on the economic front, the humanitarian front, and so forth will also require support from the international community, from other countries, from international organizations and non-governmental organizations. Yet such support may not be forthcoming absent the presence of a legitimate and credible Venezuelan government. Just to take one example, international organizations that might provide humanitarian aid may be reluctant to do so if they think the aid they're providing will not get to the intended recipients, the Venezuelan people, and instead is siphoned off by the Venezuelan government. That was a problem under the Maduro regime, and that may be still a major concern among international parties under the current regime. Next slide, please. Now, I just want to give you a brief snapshot of Venezuela's debt burden. As I mentioned earlier, it amounts to $150 billion or more. There's no precise figure, but that is the general ballpark that people are talking about, 150 billion or even higher. This represents the largest debt burden of any sovereign that has undergone a sovereign debt restructuring in recent times. It's larger than Greece in the Eurozone crisis, Argentina in its 2001 default, and Iraq in its debt restructuring post-Saddam. A second distinguishing feature of the Venezuelan debt situation is the nature of the debtors, the obligors. Venezuela's debt burden represents the debt and liabilities of not one obligor, but rather two obligors, namely the Republic of Venezuela and PDVSA. Again, most of the recent high-profile sovereign debt restructurings have involved just the debts and liabilities of one obligor. For example, if we're talking about the Argentine restructuring, we were just focused on the Republic of Argentina. Or if we were talking about the Greek restructuring of 2012 or so, we were talking about one obligor, the Hellenic Republic. We weren't talking about another major entity such as PDVSA. So here, the dual obligor structure of the Republic and PDVSA could complicate any eventual debt restructuring. A third distinguishing feature of Venezuela's debt burden is the extraordinarily diverse nature of its creditor body. Venezuela's creditor body is possibly more diverse than is found in other recent sovereign debt restructurings. Next page, please. Now, I want to briefly review the key factors that will make a Venezuelan debt restructuring so complicated. Generally speaking, any Venezuelan debt restructuring is likely to be one of the most, if not the most, complex of all recent sovereign debt restructurings. And given some of the challenges that will go along with any Venezuelan debt restructuring, that debt restructuring process is likely to be a fairly protracted affair, possibly lasting a few years at least. That's my view. Furthermore, in light of the competing interests among the broad range of stakeholders, as well as the large stakes that are involved, the dollar amounts, it could very well be a most contentious restructuring process. And finally, a Venezuelan debt restructuring might not gain any real traction until there are signs of recovery in the Venezuelan economy, as I was mentioning earlier, and also until there are signs of progress on the humanitarian and political fronts. Because, for example, on the political front, creditors won't want to negotiate with a government that won't be able to deliver on its commitments. And that will be very hard if there's not a legitimate and credible government in place. Next slide, please. I want to talk about the extraordinary diversity of Venezuela's creditor body, because that is a huge challenge for any Venezuelan debt restructuring that will take place. Venezuela, as I mentioned earlier, has an incredibly diverse and also very large creditor body. Such a large and diverse creditor body will make it extremely hard for creditors to coordinate among themselves and to achieve consensus on a restructuring plan. For instance, on the coordination issue, it will be very challenging for the creditors to form steering committees that will negotiate on their behalf with Venezuela or PDVSA, because there are such diverse and competing interests. There's a high possibility of serious inter-creditor conflict among and between different creditor constituencies, since these different creditor constituencies have such fundamentally different interests and different legal claims. Now, to quickly go over the different creditor constituencies, first and foremost, there are the bondholders. Those are holders of Republic of Venezuela bonds and PDVSA bonds. And there's estimated to be approximately 50 to 60 billion of debt, which is split roughly evenly between PDVSA and the Republic. Then there are trade creditors and suppliers, and perhaps more so than in a number of recent sovereign debt restructurings, they're a major creditor constituency here, because Venezuela and PDVSA, they have many overdue payments to the trade creditors and suppliers, such as the oil field service providers. And they are owed billions and billions of dollars by Venezuela and or PDVSA. Now we have another interesting creditor constituency, which we don't always see in these large sovereign debt restructurings, but which is very prominent in the Venezuelan case, and those are the arbitration award holders. There are a number of multi-billion-dollar judgments outstanding against the Republic of Venezuela. For example, ConocoPhillips has a huge judgment. I believe it's in the range of $8 to $9 billion. Then there are promissory note holders. There are multilaterals or development banks such as the Inter-American Development Bank and CAF, the Andean Development Bank. And there are the bilateral creditors. And we'll talk about this further in a little while, but in particular here, the bilateral creditors include Russia and China. There are other bilateral creditors, but they have nowhere near the size of exposure that Russia and China have. And as we'll discuss, the bilateral creditors could play an important role in this restructuring. Then there's a fairly obscure group of creditors, what I call here the blocked payment claimants. These are parties that were owed money, but the foreign exchange got blocked by the central bank. For example, airlines that had been flying into Venezuela and that had sold tickets on a retail basis inside Venezuela, but were then expecting to be remitted U.S. dollars for those ticket sales. When those dollars were withheld, they had a blocked payment claim. And so that's another category of creditor claims. And I read some time ago that was a not insignificant claim, perhaps over $1 billion. I don't know what it is, where it stands today, but it's still not a trivial number. Although compared to the exposure of the bondholders, of course, that looks fairly small. Next slide, please. Now, another major factor complicating a Venezuelan debt restructuring are the major uncertainties for variables that are crucial to developing a restructuring plan. Just to step back for a second, when developing a restructuring plan, the parties need to develop what is essentially an economic and financial model. Often the IMF takes the lead on in this process when it develops the debt sustainability analysis, sometimes referred to the DSA. But in developing any restructuring plan and or debt sustainability analysis, it will be necessary to make economic growth projections for Venezuela. But under the current circumstances, that will be very, very challenging. As I note here, with Venezuela's currently collapsed economy, it may be very difficult to make reliable projections as to what Venezuela's growth rate will be over the medium to longer term. This is the case because Venezuela's economy has contracted so significantly since the onset of the crisis, as I mentioned earlier. It's rare to have a sovereign debt restructuring situation where the national economy has been as seriously degraded as Venezuela's economy has been since the onset of the crisis. As we mentioned earlier, there's been a 75% contraction of the economy. So that means that the economy is or was in recent times 1/4 the size it was at the beginning of the crisis. Furthermore, Venezuela's future growth rates will depend on how quickly and comprehensively Venezuela can rebuild its economy virtually from the ground up. And again, that's an unusual situation for these sovereign debt restructurings. And its ability to rebuild its economy will depend in no small part on how much capital Venezuela can attract for investment in the economy. A point to bear up, if you could go back 1 second, Carlos. A point to bear in mind on this investment, and I don't discuss this at any length in the presentation, but as you know, investors will be looking for a reliable investment framework and for legal protections, and they won't put their money in unless they believe they have that type of those types of protections and legal framework. Next slide, please. Then we come to the issue of projections as to oil price and level of oil production. Both price and the level of oil production are key variables, but they are difficult to predict with any accuracy under current circumstances. As you all know, Venezuela's current level of oil production is at such a severely depressed level, and it is therefore hard to predict when it will return to more normal levels. Venezuela was producing 3 million barrels a day in the early 2000s, but recently it has only been producing approximately 1 million barrels a day. The point is that Venezuela can't just flip a switch and go from 1 million barrels a day production to 3 million barrels a day production. It's likely to take tens of billions of dollars and considerable time for Venezuela to sharply increase its level of oil production. Oil prices are inherently volatile. I think the events of the last few weeks demonstrate that very clearly. When before the Iran war started, the price of oil was in the low 60s, and now it's hovered above $100 a barrel. The bottom line, it's therefore difficult to project where oil prices will be in a few months, much less in a few years. Next slide, please. Another major complicating factor, which I alluded to earlier, is the potential for geopolitical complications given the role of China and Russia in Venezuela's debt situation. China and Russia are Venezuela's largest bilateral creditors. In any eventual Venezuelan debt restructuring, China and Russia, unlike financial creditors, may be driven by a range of non-financial considerations, such as geopolitical, strategic, foreign policy considerations that perhaps will be most relevant to Russia, and considerations related to continued access to natural resources. Perhaps that'll be most relevant in the case of China. To the extent geopolitical or other non-financial considerations enter the picture, that could complicate the restructuring dynamics considerably. And one further nuance here, resulting from the U.S. military operation on January 3rd, relates to the expanded role of the U.S. government in Venezuelan affairs since the Maduro capture. The issue is whether that expanded U.S. role will extend to any type of U.S. involvement in restructuring negotiations, and if so, whether such involvement will make any geopolitical issues even more fraught than they would otherwise be, particularly given the currently existing tensions between the U.S. on the one hand and China and Russia on the other hand. Next slide, please. A further complicating factor relates to litigation and arbitration claims and judgments. I mentioned some of the arbitration claimed judgments earlier. Both Venezuela and PDVSA are facing a range of claims and judgments from lawsuits and arbitration. To the extent that any of these judgments and awards are enforced, this has the potential to carve up the assets of the Republic and or PDVSA. And that may lead to certain creditors achieving significant recoveries, those creditors who are enforcing on their judgments, before other creditors receive any consideration as part of a restructuring. And this could encourage a so-called race to the courthouse. And it could also lead to what insolvency specialists would refer to as a piecemeal dismemberment of the insolvency estate. In other words, a carving up of the insolvency estate before there's a restructuring plan or process in place. As a result, any assets that could otherwise be used to support a debt restructuring might no longer be available to do so. Next slide, please. Next slide, please.
Yeah. You got it?
No, not. Oh, yes. Thank you. Thank you. It looked like the same as the last slide. Thank you, Carlos. Sorry, my fault. Now, what I'm talking about is reflected most clearly in the Citgo situation. As I note here, a case in point is the ongoing court-supervised auction and sale process with respect to equity interests that control Citgo, which is formerly called Citgo Petroleum Corporation. That process is still ultimately subject to approval by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, and final court approval, among other things. As most of you, I'm sure, know, Citgo has long been considered the so-called crown jewel of the PDVSA corporate group. But if the sale of such equity interests ultimately goes through and control of Citgo thereby shifts to third parties, PDVSA's assets will be significantly diminished. In other words, there would be a smaller pool of assets to support a restructuring for creditors, particularly PDVSA creditors. Next slide, please. If that weren't challenging enough, the capture of Maduro and the Trump administration response introduced a new wild card to the equation, and that is the Trump's administration's executive order on Venezuela of January 9, 2026. I'll just briefly discuss this. I'm not providing a comprehensive review of the executive order, which would be beyond the scope of this presentation. Venezuelan oil revenues are to be held in U.S.-controlled accounts. The executive order shields those Venezuelan oil revenues from enforcement actions by creditors. And for our purposes, importantly, it also places control over the allocations of those funds in the hands of the U.S. government, including the U.S. Treasury, the U.S. State Department, and so forth. Generally, those funds are to be deployed for broadly defined governmental, foreign policy, and national security purposes. that is not given great definition, but based on what the Trump administration has said, that might include stabilization of Venezuela. It might include humanitarian relief. It might even include counter-narcotics operations. We'll have to see how that plays out. But for our purposes, the important point is creditors could potentially find themselves disadvantaged relative to U.S. government policy objectives, since funds could be used for purposes that are prioritized over creditor repayment. I don't want to get too technical here, but some might refer to this as a de facto subordination of creditors resulting from government policy. Yet the extent of any impact on creditors and creditor recoveries could depend on how the executive order is implemented. Next slide, please. Okay, I want to quickly go over what a restructuring deal might look like in terms of the tools that might be employed. There are the traditional restructuring tools, debt forgiveness, sometimes referred to as haircuts, rescheduling or reprofiling of payment dates, including use of grace periods, modification of interest rate structures. For example, there might be a step up in rates as the structure for interest rates. Then there could be debt for equity swaps. We usually think of debt for equity swaps in the corporate context, corporate debt restructuring context, but they have been used in prior sovereign debt restructurings, particularly in connection with privatizations of state-owned enterprises. For instance, Venezuela itself used debt for equity exchanges in the Brady-era exchanges. Here's a technical point, but it will be important if debt for equity swaps are used in the Venezuelan context. In those earlier Brady-era exchanges, local currency was used in those debt for equity swaps, but that would no longer be useful given the deeply devalued state of the Venezuelan currency. Next slide, please. So in addition to those traditional restructuring tools, there might be other newer and more innovative restructuring tools that are brought to bear. That might include possible expansion of what I was just talking about as the traditional sovereign debt for equity swaps. For example, equity interests might be broadened to include development rights of oil and other minerals. Of course, those development rights would have to be valued properly. There'd have to be a proper valuation exercise, and so forth. A second type of innovative restructuring tool would be debt for climate swaps. These used to be called debt for nature swaps. These have been used in a number of recent sovereign debt restructurings, such as in Belize and Seychelles. In the case of Venezuela, they could be used, for example, to protect Venezuela's vast rainforest and any other important ecological assets that Venezuela has. In other words, the creditors would forgive debt that Venezuela owes, but in return, Venezuela would have to make commitments to spend money to protect its ecological assets, such as its rainforest, for example. Then finally, another form of innovative restructuring tools are so-called value recovery instruments. The basic idea is that the creditors they may agree to some of the more conservative projections produced by the government that underpin the restructuring plan, but they want to get some upside if things turn out better than expected. For example, if GDP performs better than expected, they would like some of that surplus, if you will, to be used to pay down their debt, for example. Another form of value recovery instruments that might be most relevant in the Venezuelan situation, given the centrality of oil to Venezuela, would be so-called oil-linked warrants. Now, the warrants might operate based on if the price of oil exceeds a certain strike price, then there would be a pay down of some of the debt. But in the case of Venezuela, just relying on price alone would be sufficient because the production levels are so low so that even if the price skyrockets as it is now, that doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be a huge increase in revenue coming into the coffers. There'll be more revenue. But what I'm trying to say is that for Venezuela, given the fact that it's producing so much below its potential, it might be necessary for such warrants to focus on these two elements together, price plus level of production, so that one arrives at a concept of total oil revenues. So these are likely to be discussed in connection with any Venezuelan sovereign debt restructuring. They were already being discussed, but not with great specificity yet. Next slide, please. I just want to briefly talk about elements of an economic restructuring plan. First and foremost, Venezuela needs an overarching economic strategy to guide its economic restructuring efforts. As I say here, it's critically important that Venezuela diversify its economy. Diversification makes sense for several reasons. As the economists would say, over-reliance on one commodity can have deleterious effects for the rest of the economy. For example, by siphoning off capital from other parts of the economy that might be able to use that capital productively. Sometimes this is referred to as the resource curse. And there's another reason that relates to the current concerns about climate change. The oil and gas sector worldwide will likely face demand constraints in the coming years as the world transitions to a net zero economy. And Venezuela will likely not be immune to these demand pressures. And thus, Venezuela needs to plan for a future where hydrocarbons will no longer be the mainstay of its economy. Next slide, please. Venezuela also needs to focus its economy on sectors in which it would enjoy a comparative advantage. Sectors which will generate a reliable and steady stream of foreign exchange. Venezuela could diversify its economy into areas such as ecotourism, alternative energy, whether that's hydro or solar, logistics and services, specialty steel and aluminum, high value added agro-processing, critical minerals. These are just some of the ideas I've been thinking about. Next slide, please. Other key elements of an economic restructuring plan: reform and privatization of unprofitable, inefficient state-owned enterprises, Also, repair and upgrading of infrastructure across the board in areas such as electricity, roads, highways, ports, water, sanitation, telecom, and digital. Of course, the oil infrastructure also needs to be upgraded given the lack of maintenance and lack of capital investment over years. But one point to bear in mind here is that the upgrade of these other forms of infrastructure that I was just discussing, such as electricity and water and sanitation, those broader forms of non-oil infrastructure, those could have important impacts on the oil sector itself. Because it's hard to produce the oil unless there's a steady and reliable flow of electricity and water, etc. Next slide, please. And here's where we'll conclude. Here I discuss how debt restructuring could reinforce economic reconstruction efforts. First, debt for equity swaps could be used to direct investment to high priority economic sectors, such as those I was mentioning earlier. Debt for nature or climate swaps could dovetail with efforts to develop ecotourism in Venezuela. Upgrade of infrastructure will have beneficial effects for a broad range of economic activity in Venezuela. Privatization reform of SOE sector will free up capital for investment for more productive uses. Generally, debt restructuring will allow Venezuela to re-enter capital markets to raise financing for investment in the Venezuelan economy and will also create fiscal space for the Venezuelan government. We've come to the end of the presentation. I thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much for offering us this comprehensive vision of Venezuelan debt structure and economic reconstruction. When I heard you, I heard a lot of things that we had to do. It may sound like a pessimistic vision, but it's not. It's just realistic of the facts that we need to take in consideration. For that, we appreciate this presentation a lot. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Interesting talk, Stephen. Question. The fact of matter that about the current ad hoc government is PDVSA ad hoc, etc., is that it's not entirely new and much of the other structure remains intact, as you pointed out. Many of the heads of this new government were responsible, he's talking about the interim government now. Many of the heads of this new government were responsible of the major catastrophic situation of the country. Then, with that state of very untrustworthy affair, how the required investment may appear. At first glance, it seems that it's an insurmountable challenge. I think you addressed that in your presentation, but what they're asking is, do you see any possibility? And I had that question already here. Can you see any possibility of permanent economic reconstruction with the present arrangement that the U.S. has with Venezuela? U.S. totaling the previous. You see the question?
Yes. One of the key pillars of any economic reconstruction will be investment. And investment capital will have to come perhaps in large part from foreign investors. And the question is whether foreign investors will want to put their money at risk in a system where there may not be strong legal protections of private property and other investor protections. And so that could prove to be a major hindrance to that foreign investment coming in. And then again, sometimes, as you know, national governments either extend assistance or they make loans based on export credits to developing countries and emerging markets. But query whether those governments would be willing to do that for a government which the questioner says under Ms. Rodriguez looks very much like the government under Mr. Maduro, which they consider to be an illegitimate government. Now, the U.S. government, of course, has taken a different position so far, but these other governments, that could be a problem until they get comfortable with the political arrangements in Venezuela. And that's why in my presentation I underline the need for a credible and legitimate government.
Thank you, Steve. I had another question here. In addition to identifying and categorizing the total outstanding debts, what are the 2 or 3 most critical steps that a new democratic government, a new legitimate democratic government, let's say, must take to effectively address the debt restructuring problem? The 3 more important.
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I was touching on some of the economic and financial issues when I was talking about the uncertainties in developing a model. But in any restructuring, to develop that model, you need good data, good statistical information. And so from what I understand, that type of information might not be readily available with the current government, as it wasn't available under the Maduro government. And so that would be a first step, in my view, would be one of the first steps would be to develop reliable information about Venezuela's finances, and there's got to be greater transparency about that. And a related point is that the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, hasn't come into Venezuela for its so-called Article 4 consultation in many, many years, I believe since 2004. So that's over 2 decades ago. So if the IMF gets involved, it's going to take them a while to develop reliable information. One of the key elements in any successful restructuring, including sovereign debt restructuring, is for the parties to engage in good faith negotiations, to be transparent, to be pragmatic as well. And so the new government, if it wants to reach a deal with its creditors, will have to bear that in mind, that it needs to engage in good faith negotiations. That doesn't mean it has to give in to every creditor demand, but it has to negotiate in a business-like fashion.
Okay. I had a question. I'm going to break the rule. I'm going to ask you a question related to that question that I made you. When you were making your presentation, you talk about sacrifices for the Venezuelan. And you know, in that moment, I asked my question: how much more can Venezuelan people sacrifice? I mean, they are really in the bottom of line. But can you give us some idea for what type of those sacrifices may be?
Well, Carlos, that's an excellent question, and you've touched on one of the points that make the Venezuelan situation so different from other recent sovereign debt situations. But typically, when the international creditors, particularly the IMF, get involved, they ask the governments to adopt certain adjustment policies like fiscal consolidation, and that may involve reducing certain subsidies and fuel subsidies and so on and so forth. But as you correctly point out, and as I noted in my presentation when I was talking about the humanitarian situation, the Venezuelan people are in generally speaking, are in a fairly dire strait. So how much more sacrifice could be asked of them is very could be problematic, quite frankly. But even so, I think that the Venezuelan people, they're not just going to go along with the plan that the government proposes, sacrifice or no sacrifice, unless there's a credible and legitimate government in place. Because some of the things I was talking about, Carlos, for example, debt for equity swaps, if the government is giving away government-owned assets, the Venezuelan people want to have confidence that the government is getting proper consideration for that there's been proper valuation of those assets. So I agree with the general thrust of your question, and in fact, the thrust of your question aligns with my general point that Venezuela is not simply a restructuring situation where adjustment policies of the type I was mentioning are the answer, because Venezuela, the economy has collapsed. So just trimming the budget here or trimming the budget there is not going to get Venezuela to where it needs to be. It needs to rebuild the economy, and it's going to need the involvement of the Venezuelan people to do that. So, again, I think the Venezuelan people will want a government that they respect, that they believe is credible and legitimate, to the extent that they are going to sign up for the debt restructuring and any economic reconstruction plan.
Thank you, Steve. The next question is, do you consider it technically and politically feasible to integrate an index debt service cap clause into the new 2026 contract, stipulating that the total annual payment cannot exceed 25% of the settled all revenue, similar to Mexico in 1986?
I don't, I'm not sure that would be feasible, that the creditors would go for that. I would have to look at the example he cites in greater depth, but what's more likely to happen is that the government will demand a large haircut, and based on fairly conservative revenue projections, and then so the creditors might take a big hit, but then the creditors would have the upside of those value recovery instruments I was talking about if Venezuela performs better than expected, whether that's GDP or oil revenues. So I'm not sure the creditors would be so eager to sign up to such a cap.
Okay.
There have been situations, there's been discussion of what they call state contingent debt instruments, where if the GDP collapses, then the debt service payments are ratcheted downward. but I'm not sure the cap would be as acceptable as that.
Okay. There is a question here. Let's see. Can you explain? I think the person is asking if you can give us some idea how can Venezuela get into the tourist market.
Oh, well, that's a good question. First of all, uh, look at your neighbor, Colombia. Okay, 20 years ago, no one wanted to go to Colombia because here in America, for example, they thought it was all controlled by the drug cartels,
Right.
Mr. Escobar and his compatriots. So the perception was terrible. And so, even though Colombia is a beautiful country, just as Venezuela is a beautiful country, people don't want to go if they don't believe it's safe.
Right.
And I remember I went down to Colombia in about 2008 or 9, and I was at a program where some of the government officials were speaking, the Colombian government officials, and the Minister of Tourism was there. And this was my first trip to Colombia, and I was in Medellin, and I thought it's a very pretty city, and I didn't see too many security or safety issues, or at least what we had been told was the case. You know, it's an incredibly dangerous place. Of course, you got to take precautions wherever you are. But I told them, you've got to get the word out that Colombia has changed, that it is now a much safer place. And I think their tourism has recovered quite significantly since the days of the drug cartels running so much of the country. So I think image is one thing that's not my area of expertise, marketing, but as you know, tourists they don't want to go to destinations where they think that they'll have problems of being robbed or kidnapped or other safety issues. And on the other hand, I think another selling point for Venezuela is what I was discussing throughout the presentation, which was Venezuela's got such an attractive physical environment that it really could develop potentially a strong ecotourism sector, just focused on visits to the rainforests or whatever it may be. That would be something that I think the international community would find attractive. That ties into what I was talking about earlier with the concern about climate change. So I think there will have to be some creative thinking on the part of a new Venezuelan government as to how they could present this to the wider public, the wider world, actually, that Venezuela is an attractive place to visit. And it's not just people leaving Venezuela, 8 million or more, that people could come and visit Venezuela. One thing I didn't mention during the presentation, I alluded to it, but I think it will be very helpful if you could get back some of those 8 million people who've left, because there's a ton of talent sitting outside of Venezuela that could be used to help rebuild the economy. But I do think tourism could have bright prospects, and of course that's a good generator of foreign exchange.
Right, correct. Okay, next question. And you're right. You know, the perception of safety, good infrastructure, and customer service culture.
Yes.
That will be the key for tourism.
Oh, yes.
The next question is, how liable will be, this is a technical question, how liable will be a new government in Venezuela with China and Russia debts, as these funds were out in projects that they were never completed?
Well, I'd have to know the specific transactions that the questioner is asking about, but depends who was at fault for the, in part, who's at fault for the lack of completion of the project. But more generally, I think some of those loans may be reviewed to see whether there was any corruption involved, or we have a broader category of debt. We call it odious debt. That odious, O-D-I-O-U-S, it's the odious debt doctrine. I discussed it in one of my articles. But that's where the debt is not used for the benefit of the public, and there's a three-part test for odious debt, and that it hasn't been approved by the people, usually represented by the parliament or a representative body like that. It's not used for the public benefit, and the lenders should have known both of those facts. Anyway, this is just it's more a concept in my view than a doctrine, because it hasn't been applied so much, if ever. But for example, if Saddam Hussein used the proceeds of loans that he received in Iraq to build extravagant palaces, okay, and incurred a lot of debt for that, that would potentially fall under the category of odious debt. So I don't know in the Venezuelan situation whether any of the loans, for example, not for palaces, but if the loans were used for weapons that were used against the Venezuelan people to repress the Venezuelan people, that might give rise to something akin to an odious debt claim.
Okay. Well, here is another one, I think similar. The PDVSA of bonds were generated without approval by the Congress, and they should have been. Will a new government be responsible for these debts?
That's a great question, and I think in particular the concern has been with the pledge that was given in connection with some of the PDVSA bonds, whether the pledge was approved. But Carlos, those issues have been in litigation in New York, and so we'll have to see how that finally resolves itself. And but I know there have been challenges to those bonds on that basis, but that's a question that needs to be resolved in the judicial forum.
Another one in the similar line. CITCO has been auctioned. Venezuela has an interim government coming from the Maduro regime era responsible for putting CITCO as collateral. Okay? The only thing pending is an OFAC license for this creditor to be able to take over CITCO. They're asking you if you had a vision and when this could happen.
I think that's the $64,000, maybe $8 billion question. And as you may recall, going back to the first Trump administration, that administration didn't want to see creditors taking control of CITCO, in large part because they wanted to keep the asset available for that so-called interim government under Mr. Juan Guaido. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
And so it's not clear where the Trump administration, the Treasury Department, and the Office of Foreign Asset Control will come out on this issue. There's still other steps that need to be taken before the sale can go through. The judge has to make sure it complies with certain requirements of the sale and so on and so forth. But ultimately, that OFAC approval will be required, and there have been conflicting reports as to whether one newspaper says this was a month or two ago, says that the approval is on the cusp of being granted. Others say no way that approval will be granted. So we just don't know at this point what OFAC will do on that.
They just renewed the support for until April. I see 45 more days. 45 more days. They just give a new license for about 45 more days for civil protection.
They've been extending that for a long time. Right, but we don't know really where the Trump administration through the Treasury Department and OFAC will come out on that.
I had a question that's a technical.
But there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money riding on that from the point of view of the investors who want to purchase those PDV holding shares that would give them control of Citgo.
Yeah,
billions of dollars.
Billions of dollars. Okay, the next question is Professor. They title you Professor Carmen. the fact that the price of the market crude oil is currently over $100 a barrel, does not that allow for a more coherent debt restructuring plan for a country whose main export is still hydrocarbon? Or in the contrary, are these inflated prices a negative factor? I think you answered that during your presentation, but can you?
For restructuring, all things being equal, it will be better for the price of crude oil to be higher than lower. But as I mentioned, it's not just a question of price for Venezuela, it's production capability. And you all know better than I do that the oil industry in Venezuela is in a seriously degraded state, the infrastructure, but the level of production, as I mentioned several times in the presentation, is so depressed that, for a long time it was under 1 million barrels a day. So it's not just a question of price as to the prospects for Venezuela and whether that will make a restructuring easier or not. It's also when Venezuela can rebuild that production capacity. And in turn, that depends on investment, whether the billions and billions of dollars will come into Venezuela to upgrade the infrastructure and so forth. And that will take time. It will take time.
Okay, there is a political question here that I'm going to pass that political question to the sobremesa so we don't record it, okay? Let's go back, let's do the new one. During Trump IOC meeting, Trump and International Company meeting, he suggested that previous claim agreements, including legal dispute over the expropriation and compensation, should be set aside. Would it be possible for an international oil company to move beyond previous conflict, return to Venezuela, and contribute to the recovery of the oil sector? What are the potential benefits and risks for international companies if they choose to set aside past dispute and investment in a new Venezuelan oil sector?
I'm not sure I followed the whole question, but
let me give you a resume.
Yes.
The question is, if the international company, Exxon, Conoco, etc., that have debt dispute with Venezuela,
Right.
and they set those debt disputes aside and go ahead and go invest in Venezuela for a new project, what could be the consequence for those companies, which are private companies?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I'm not sure they're going to set aside their disputes. They have judgments. ConocoPhillips has a huge judgment. So, but this may tie somewhat into the debt for equity discussion I was having. That those parties with judgments or with outstanding claims against Venezuela, such as the oil field service providers, they don't have arbitration judgments, at least not on the scale of those oil companies and the mining companies. They may be able to think about that in that debt for equity swap context I was discussing. Okay, but I can't talk about if the oil companies unilaterally give up their claims. I wouldn't want to give an opinion on what kind of blowback they might have from their shareholders, for example.
Yeah, shareholders mainly. Yeah.
Yes. But on the debt for equity swap front, that would be a different thing, because they wouldn't just be giving away the claims, they would be getting value for it.
Right, and that is the last question here is, I would say, is your answer could relate to this question. Do you consider the possibility of returning all assets to Exxon and Conoco that were previously expropriated could be a positive factor for this company to reinvest in the country?
Well, one thing I remember from that meeting, Carlos, that White House meeting that President Trump had with the oil executives, I remember the CEO of ExxonMobil came out and said Venezuela is currently uninvestable. So I think, I may be wrong, but I think it may take some time before the major oil companies are ready to put major investments back into Venezuela. I think, for one thing, they'll want a stable political framework, but also they'll want the legal certainty, the legal protections, the investor protections. Venezuela, some years ago, withdrew from the International Arbitration Tribunal, ICSID, International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. That might send a positive sign to the foreign investors if Venezuela rejoined ICSID. Those are some of the conditions I think the foreign investors will be looking for, at least those making major investments, because why put the money into Venezuela if you could put it into a safer environment? So that's what I would say on that.
Yeah, during Sarah Week, I attended the presentation of Conoco CEO and Exxon CEO especially, and Chevron was. And both Conoco and Exxon say, they say what you just say, they want rule of law, and then, okay. But I was really the Exxon person, the Exxon CEO. Even he said Venezuela is uninvestable. He said this week that he had a technical team assessment Venezuela infrastructure for oil development. So they really are interested. I mean, it's a matter of resolving some of these issues. Okay. Well, Mr. Garman, thank you very much for for your presentation. You gave us a chicken cooking book recipe for Venezuela, and I like also, for your response to the question. We really appreciate your participation with us and your time. Okay, so now we're going to pass to the sobremesa.
Okay, Carlos, let me just thank you and Eduardo for organizing this, and let me thank all of the attendees for their attention and, as usual, their excellent questions. It's been a real pleasure to do this again with you.
Well, please stay with us it will take for a few minutes, few additional